Blomcast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the Blomcast, the podcast that looks at changing points in history. And today's changing point is a changing point in ideas and a very important one. And to discuss it, I'm very pleased to welcome into the Blomcast Samuel Moyn. Sam, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sam, you're a professor of law and history at Yale, and you're also author of some really very exciting books, very often centered around the idea and development of human rights, such as The Last Utopia or Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World. And I think we'll come back to that idea as well. But also recently a beautiful and controversial book, Liberalism Against Itself, in which, well, you really say it all with the first sentence, namely Cold War liberalism was a catastrophe for liberalism. But before we delve into that, let's just let this hang here as a teaser, because when I prepared this and I listened to some interviews that you had given, you mentioned a beautiful idea that I think is really important to unpack for people, because it has such a stranglehold on our imagination, and that is your idea of retroactive continuity. We are living in a world today, in a world with certain ideas, and for many people there's this sort of perception is it has to be this way, and it's more or less always been like this, and it's necessary that it is like this. And tell us about retroactive continuity.
Well, honestly, it's not my idea, but is I think devised to talk about at least American television, and in that context, the idea is that those who make shows that we stream have always the problem of things that people will remember about past episodes. And they always have to, in a sense, remain continuous with those memories. They can't resurrect someone who's already dead. They have to, keep the characters within the parameters of what has been established in prior episodes. I think, in my work and in that of historians in general, some of us want, in a sense, to show that the past was very different than the way it's remembered in the present, and that there could be major shifts in the past that we've forgotten, as if our present was always kind of in the making the way it is now. And the reason we try to destabilize the present in this way is because we think there should be big changes in the future, and that may mean seeing big changes that have been suppressed in the past.
It is such an interesting and such an important idea that our present is contingent and really the result of a ton of stupid mistakes. It could be very different, and that perhaps liberates us also to think that it could be different. This is not a necessary order. Because what I find when I engage with your work, what I find so fascinating is something that I try to do in mine, namely thinking together ideas and lived history, lived historical experience, seeing how ideas change around historical traumata. You can see that with individuals, and you can see that with collectives such as states. I come from a country, Germany, where a historical trauma, of course, completely changed the ethos of the country. The ethos of the culture, like Japan, changed it unrecognizably, as we now see with Germany's reticence in the Ukraine war. So this idea of, as you say, retroactive continuity, that you retroactively construct history as something necessary and logical, though it was never experienced as such, that brings us to this project that you've just published now, Liberalism Against Itself. And I've been talking a bit in this series of talks, also with some guests, about the history of what I call the liberal project. So liberalism in a philosophical sense, in the sense of emphasis on individual right, on individual dignity, on emancipation, on liberation, not liberalism in a party political sense or in a neoliberal sense. And it seems to me that this project is really in danger of dying. That this project has brought enormous light, but also cast enormous shadows, and that we are not very good at reading those shadows. And that this project is really at death's door, and that I believe would be a great loss to humanity. Now, let's just pinpoint where your work is. It is with the what you call the Cold War liberals, a group that you identify. You could probably choose one or two more, or leave one or two out if you wanted to, but it's a loose group. But it's a group of thinkers who redefine the whole liberal project during the Cold War. Tell us about that quickly.
Well, so I start from what other historians have taught me, which is that there was not one liberal project. There was in the 19th century, I think, much more unity to liberalism, although it was still internally differentiated, and there were a lot of different kinds of liberals. The 19th century is when there are liberals who call themselves liberals the first time, and we tend not to look very closely at that period. I think partly because of what happened in the 20th century when what we called earlier retroactive continuity was established between 19th century liberals and some pre-liberals, most notably John Locke. But I argue that whatever you think about the internal diversity of liberalism before the 20th century, it really did mutate as a tradition in the period between roughly the 1930s and 1950s.
What made it mutate? What made it, just as particularly in this period, what made it mutate?
Well, I think there are a lot of causes. One is harsh experience. If you've lived through the collapse of Weimar and what that stands for, I mean, if you've lived through World War II and then the fracturing of the Western Alliance into a new Cold War, you might, have lived a damaged life. Especially if you've had personal adversity or exile as a result of it. And of course, here it's worth noting that many of the leading spokesmen of Cold War liberalism were Jews in general, or emigre Jews in particular, like Isaiah Berlin. But I think mainly it was a choice. It was less a kind of necessary response to experience, but a decision to set the sights of liberalism lower. In the 19th century, its leading figures had stressed emancipation and even creativity, individually and collectively, as our highest goal as human beings. In the 20th century, the leading figures stressed the sheer threat matrix of politics, and especially the expanding states that came to be called totalitarian states. And they said liberalism has to be about freedom from damage, not so much emancipation into freedom.
That's a line that is carried from Isaiah Berlin to Judith Sklar, not very well-known thinkers on the continent, not very well-known thinkers to German-speaking people, but just very quickly, negative and positive freedoms. It's simply negative freedoms are freedoms from coercion, freedoms from violence, etc. And positive freedoms would be the more exciting one. Is that perhaps step one and step two in the development of a civilized society? First, you have the freedom from harm, and then you may, if you get very lucky, get the freedom to develop yourself, the freedom to unfold your gifts and to live in a healthy community?
I think that, Well, I think first of all we should capture what Berlin, whose essay "Two Concepts of Liberty" you're referring to, said about the two forms, because it wasn't so much that the positive form is about kind of economics or welfare state. It was about freedom as self-realization. A very German idea connected, well, not Nietzschean really, so much as earlier, it connects with the much older, Humboldtian idea of Bildung, and it connects really with the Romantic movement, which affected all the early liberals. It's true Nietzsche takes this romantic idea of self-creation in a radical direction, and in an almost antisocial direction. But liberals thought liberal societies should be ones that make self-realization possible collectively. And a good example is John Stuart Mill, who in his 1859 tract on liberty references precisely Humboldt as his inspiration for positive liberty. I think it's very plausible to think that we could connect these two concepts of liberty as a sequence, but that's not what Cold War liberalism was about. It was about the necessity of choosing and really rejecting positive liberty as proto-totalitarian, and instead focusing solely on freedom from interference, especially coercive interference by the state.
You make a quite fascinating connection here, or a little bit later. It already was alluded to in one of your book titles, namely the fact that liberalism very much developed into a discourse about human rights. And what the liberal discussion moved very much into the field of human rights. And you show that there may be a correlation, or indeed more than a coincidence, there may be some sort of causality, that when the talk of human rights explodes, it's exactly also the time when what is quite inaccurately but usefully called neoliberalism takes off in the world. And that the whole discussion of human rights had a tendency, at least at the beginning, to completely ignore the economic conditions that went along with it.
So, this is, generally right. I think you could add detail by saying that it's very important that human rights emerge in the 1940s on a national scale, but don't prompt the kind of culture of human rights, and especially advocacy mobilization around them, that we see when human rights are internationalized in the later period. And it's just an interesting fact that in those early years of the 1940s, there was a universal declaration of human rights that included economic and social rights. And of course, many West Europeans, and for that matter, East Europeans who embrace new kinds of constitutions, are also building welfare states, and sometimes even entertain economic and social rights in ways that Anglophones really never have. However, you're totally correct that in their international form, with the rise of kind of transnational human rights movements, and for that matter, the European Union, you really do get a focus on a kind of civil libertarian reading of what rights matter. I've gone beyond that and said that even after 1989, when finally a lot of people begin to care more about distributive kinds of rights, rights to housing and food and sanitation and so forth. And there's a European social charter, much less important than, many of the, commitments to rights in constitutions or in the European Union. Nonetheless, these are framed in terms of what we call sufficient provision. They say rights in the economic and social realm are about getting enough of whatever it is, food, water, housing. They're not egalitarian. And actually, in both periods, the more civil libertarian period after the 1960s and 70s, and in the more generous period, um, there's no attention to widening class inequality, and so it's this, I think, that's the connection with neoliberalism. The Austrian sage Friedrich von Hayek, when he attacks the welfare state in the 1940s and the road to serfdom, his main enemy is the planning state. He actually says, I have no problem with welfare minima, like old persons or injured persons should get help when they can't work. He hated the planning state, the totalitarian state, as it kind of migrated west.
But was it the totalitarian suspicion that animated these Cold War liberals so much?
Absolutely, that both the neoliberals and the Cold War liberals. So that I think in my book is the principal connection between these two different groups. I'm just making the point that some of them could be, in a sense, kinds of social democrats, the way that Isaiah Berlin was, and or even like Hayek in his early years, except versions of like basic minimum distributional justice. Milton Friedman supported what we now call a universal basic income, helped invent the idea of it. What really got lost, I think, in the age of human rights was concern about class equality, which I think is just very different conceptually from the idea even of economic and social rights. And so I did write this book called Not Enough, which asks us to think critically about what we abandoned in our enthusiasm for human rights since the 1960s and 70s.
I find it interesting to try to draw a causal connection here because it seems to me that we're sort of constructing ourselves back into pre-1789 societies, that we're refeudalizing our societies, that we're building tiny classes of super rich people who live by other rules, who don't pay the taxes that other people do, who have several passports, who always have options, who have their money abroad. And that these people have a disproportionate influence on our political decision making, on our social lives, etc. And that effectively ends the idea of a democracy with one person, one vote, and has already ended it, and creates, funnily enough, a lot of very disaffected people who probably don't have to starve, but who also do not participate in the rising creation of wealth and of opportunity. Never mind what happens to the climate in the course of creating that wealth. But that this exploding inequality brings us really back into a pre-1789 situation.
I think that's very perceptive. I mean, what is distinctive about it, of course, is that it's neo-feudal, which means that there aren't literally formal legal castes. And in fairness, the neoliberal era has seen a lot of skepticism about what I would call status hierarchy, which is saying that the kind of person you are determines your lesser entitlements, the way that people used to think that being black racially or being a woman just entitled you to less in the rules. Now, of course, there's still a lot of racism and patriarchy, but a lot of that has gotten washed away because neoliberals care a lot about a utopia of the market in which everyone is treated as equal, as a transactor. But of course, they're not treated as equal in the unequal outcomes that they can establish through market activity. And as you say, this creates a new kind of old regime, if you will, in which there are aristocrats, but they're not nobles under the law. They're nobles as a result of the new market hierarchies. And those are the ones that neoliberals defend.
I find that very interesting because it's always the problem of the nouveau riche that they don't have the trappings of the old rich. But the aristocracy, at least partly, also understood itself as a guardian of a certain ethos, of a certain way of living, certainly in combination with the church. And that way of living, as we know, got very damaged in the 20th century, actually got destroyed. When you look at these Cold War liberals, you have a feeling that they're disappointed liberals. What precisely do you think they had lost?
Well, I think those are really interesting observations. I think the point about the aristocracy, could allow for a lot of thinking, because liberals have to decide in what form they tolerate any hierarchy. And you and I have been complaining about how an old dissolute nobility, basically of birth, has gotten replaced by a new nobility of the market. I'm a big fan, as of John Stuart Mill, of Alexis de Tocqueville, who was, of course, a noble. And he said, I agree that the 18th century nobility was terrible, but we still need like an idea of distinction. And part of it is, as you say, the sense of responsibility that went along with the old nobility, at least occasionally. Although, of course, the German nobility, not a happy story in the 1920s and 30s. But I would say Tocqueville's even deeper commitment, the liberal form of aristocracy, um, you know, is the idea of having something big to aim for and high to achieve. And again, Nietzsche, who called himself an aristocratic radical, takes that in an antisocial, radical direction. But liberals, might have to embrace ideas about distinction, even if they reject wealth. Now, the Cold War liberals, I think, they were not nostalgic for the old days of the nobility in the way that Tocqueville was. And I think that's because they thought that, what really mattered is that any person in principle could live a liberal life. So that I think is something that is uplifting about the Cold War liberals. My trouble with them is that for them, the liberal life was one where essentially you were on your own. You ought to be protected from interference by the state, but not given a public ideal of what your life is about and what society is about, which for the original liberals before the Cold War was about launching you into creativity and distinction and making progress possible. And the Cold War liberals rejected all that because they thought it was all an alibi for totalitarian state.
I have to run a sentence by you that slightly obsesses me, that I'm throwing at all sorts of people at the moment. It comes from a German constitutional judge by the beautiful name of Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde. And he said something in the 1960s that I can't get out of my head. It's a very simple observation saying the liberal secular state rests on assumptions it cannot guarantee itself. We see that in your beautiful country at the moment. I think we also see it in Europe in equally dramatic ways. Assumptions of, shall we say, possibly a certain respect, a certain trust that others will observe the rules of the game at least. I mean, a democracy is all about a non-violent changeover of power. When I look at these liberals, I see them torn between a very strong ethos, such as in Isaiah Berlin, a very disappointed ethos, perhaps such as in Karl Popper, but they retrench. They retrench also morally to a minimalist position. And it seems to me that you can't run a society without a common project, without a common sense of, I don't want to say destiny, but a common sense of history, perhaps, a shared narrative, to put it in a trendy way. We know how ambivalent those narratives, how oppressive these narratives have been in the past, and that's why they have been opposed and destroyed. But we are quite bereft in our societies, and therefore perhaps even more easily prey to narratives that give people simply an answer to their craving for meaning. Could you enlarge a little bit on that, on this sort of moral minimalism that you describe so eloquently in that book and its consequences?
Well, you've done so, beautifully yourself. I mean, I would say that the Cold War liberals did fear that an emphasis on commonality, especially one that was public and implicated the purposes of the state, was already latently totalitarian. And so, in a sense, they privatized freedom almost entirely. But that leaves people without a sense of what their lives are for, unless they're lucky enough to, come up with one on their own, and may, leave them alone when it comes to, shouldering the burden of freedom. I think the Birkenförde dictum is, of course, very famous and important, but the contentious question is, what is presupposed? Not whether the constitutional liberal state has presuppositions, but what they are. And of course, in his own career, he thought a lot about religion and tradition. But what interests me about the 19th century liberals before the Cold War liberals ruined everything is that they were post-Christian. They were almost all, obsessed by the idea that they needed to provide a kind of new religion or a new framework for modern meaning. In this, they were very close to another German philosopher, Hegel. And in a sense, to many of them, it didn't matter much whether you describe this as the last stage of Christianity or a supersession of it, but it was just very, I think, different than Birkenförde's more nostalgic commitment. And I think we're still in the position of those 19th century liberals trying to understand what, post-religious set of meanings could be valid for a kind of legitimate public culture. And I believe that they said very powerful things about how creativity and self-making are appealing enough to enough people that they could be better institutionalized than they are. And I agree with you that our failure in this regard is leaving a lot of people making mistakes, choosing the right, which promises them meaning, because liberals refuse to even try.
This brings me to a nexus really exciting. I've done quite a lot of work on how the Enlightenment, at least as we see it in historiography and our retroactive continuity, namely in basically the history writing of the 19th century, that has created what we now know as the Enlightenment. I think in the 17th, 18th centuries, people would have been very surprised by that idea. But that Enlightenment, the Enlightenment of Kant and Voltaire and others, is to me intensely theological. It says that it will fight against theology and superstition, etc. But in fact, if you look at the idea of progress, which is clearly a Christian salvation story, if you look at the idea of enlightened reason and how similar it is to the Christian soul, if you look at the fact that human beings are above and outside of nature and their job is still to dominate nature, but now through science, you see how many continuities there are that are basically unquestioned by many enlighteners, by many dominant enlighteners. And that's why I'm talking about this goes right through to the founding fathers of what we now call neoliberalism, those Cold War liberals who assumed, for instance, in the economic theory that we are rational, perfectly informed and free agents, which is clearly untrue for most people in most life situations, but which makes it, I suppose, mathematically very neat for modeling. And that we are seeking self-optimization through rational means. I don't know anyone who does that. And frankly, the best argument you can see against that is why do people have children? It ruins their economic chances. It costs them a nice little house per child. It's a terrible idea in a modern economy to have children if you want to self-optimize. But obviously that is not the motivation of people's acting. So a very short question at the end of a long disquisition, but how theological is this movement and how is it possible to get rid of this theology? All respect to theologians who want to ply their trade. But if we are believing that we are having secular conversations and we're actually using old scholastic theological ideas, almost unquestioned, that seems to me to be, shall we say, not very intellectually hygienic.
It's a fantastic question. I mean, I'm tempted to say there's no alternative but some continuity with Christianity, in the same way that without Judaism there was no Christianity. But no one goes around saying that Christianity is unviable because it came from somewhere. And then there were changes. You've no doubt read, along with Birkenford, of Blumenberg, who confronted these ideas about debt. The notion that continuity means debt that you must repay to your ancestors, theologically, and responded that, well, things changed, and even when there's continuity of form, there's change in function. But the main thing I would say is that, of course, in the end, any theory that claims public authority, let alone private authority, is going to be metaphysical. It's going to appeal to, if you like, the unseen. And the religious secular divide which is real, doesn't mean that liberals can claim not to have metaphysical commitments that are very difficult to prove.
Is that enough, though? I mean, this is totally an open question. This is something I'm racking my little brains about at the moment. But I think the 20th century is a century of failing narratives, failing experiments with alternative narratives to a religious one. And whether it's socialism or communism or fascism or, really red in tooth and claw capitalism, they all fail and they all create catastrophes. And we are left wiser, more ironic, and perhaps more cynical. But actually, there is an emptiness there. And that emptiness may be maybe a phantom emptiness, but it is still felt like the loss of a limb. There is still phantom pain, and this pain has to be somehow treated if we are to have societies with a future. Am I making myself clear at all? I'm feeling I'm just rambling.
I am completely with you. I think you're identifying something very deep, which is a kind of deficit that any proposal has today, and it's really because, while in a sense religions can't fail, uh, secular projects have to prove their worth in a new way. I mean, if the Messiah fails to come or return, depending on whether you're Jewish or Christian, you can always say, I never said when, and wait till next year. Whereas these secular projects of emancipation, when they fail in this world where they claimed that they would succeed. And so there's this structural liability that any attempt to replace religion faces. However, I don't know. I mean, to me, it goes to extremes to say that, well, everything fails and, we should therefore go back to the frameworks where you don't have to keep any promises. You just leave that up to the divine someday. Because obviously the world has been set on fire by the partial successes of these emancipatory promises. Everyone wants, wealth. I think everyone wants some kind of distinction in their life so that it matters in this world. And they want the society in which they can have the meaning they want now. And so in the end, maybe this liability is one that just has to be, faced, but it's not like a conclusive reason to return to some earlier framework.
Is it asking too much of us to develop that out of ourselves? Is it asking too much of a whole population to find the strength in them for self-making, instead of lying back into a narrative that is already there prepared for them?
I wouldn't say, but I'm maybe more impressed by the fact that people thought, slavery was eternal before trying to end it. People thought that, raising taxes on rich people for some modicum of a welfare state would be futile and perverse in its consequences. And then everyone insisted on it once they'd experienced it. And that doesn't mean that there aren't perversions and political disasters or just mistakes. But I think we don't know whether what we ask of ourselves is excessive until we try. And my book is written from the perspective that maybe we're not asking enough of ourselves in our politics.
That brings me on to something that, if we think of some sort of meaningful future as societies, is the framework within which we will have to think that, which is the climate crisis, which is the fact that we are in the process of becoming very different societies, through the influence of this shifting of systems, which is after all what it is. I wrote a little book called Nature's Mutiny, where it looked at the Little Ice Age and how societies changed then, 400 years ago. But I did that, of course, with an eye to saying the same is happening to us. We are going to become completely different societies. We are obviously not the masters of nature. Perhaps we can be intelligent enough to find a different place within this closed system that allows us to survive in it. Now, that, it strikes me, is the beginning of a very, very different way of perceiving human beings and their role in this world. A much more metaphysically modest way that goes away from us being God's favorite creature to us being an interesting African ape. and a way that sees us much more entangled and enmeshed in other systems, and in fact sees individuality as something that is very intensely constructed, so intensely that we don't even know to which an extent it is an illusion. Don't you think that these realizations, which are very ambitious realizations, could be at the beginning of a kind of new narrative of what we are doing here?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm the last person who would foresee that we won't have, extraordinary mutations in collective understandings. I'm impressed by uh, liberalism as something that has lost its way, but um, even if I'm right that the future deserves to be differently but still liberal, um, there's no chance that human history doesn't have surprises in store. Um, but I do think that you know it is possible to imagine that ideas that I'd want to keep around from liberalism um, could be reconciled with um, at least some of the insights that we're gaining from our acceptance that the planet is warming and that we didn't understand how nature, in a sense, can fight back or you know um, behaves differently than we thought when we just assumed it would suffer all of the indignities we uh, have foisted on nature.
But that means again falling out of our theological cloud and really arriving with a bump on Earth.
Well, it does. I mean, but then we have to ask, for what reason do we correct? Is it because we take the view that nature should be placated um, for its own sake, or rather because it's our home and it's the necessary home for anything humans, admittedly, who are part of nature, should try to achieve for themselves? So I don't see how accepting the need for a safe home for humanity in a natural environment that's warming necessarily means that we give up on what we want for ourselves. We have to find, reasons to live and a metaphysical understanding of ourselves that's compatible with our survival. But there's a huge range of possibilities there. And I'm not sure that all of them require giving liberalism up.
Well, look, I would hope not. But you've said that if liberalism has nothing to say about its idea of a good life,
Yes.
then it has nothing to say.
Well, right. But it used to have a lot to say and lost its voice in the Cold War.
But what could that voice be in the 20th century? What could that voice be in the conditions of galloping economic inequality, of a galloping climate crisis? Let's just, for the sake of simplicity, leave out the effects of digitization. But um, how could this summum bonum look like in our time?
I accept that challenge. I think that what has impressed me most about humanity and my time in it is the novelty that humans are capable of bringing, and of course, that's one more theological idea. Creation ex nihilo used to be something that it was thought that God alone could accomplish, but liberals made the highest good universal creation. And of course, that led to lots of inequality when it took economic form, and it led the climate to begin dying or fighting back. And then the question is, what are the forms of creativity that are compatible with justice and compatible with survival? And I think there are a lot. I mean, and so it's really a matter of figuring out how we contain some forms of human emancipation that are unjust or are deadly for the environment in the name of all the rest of the forms of human emancipation.
I'm still after an outline of that narrative.
Well, here I'm with Nietzsche in a certain way. I think Nietzsche, again, just took to radical extremes what the Romantics and the Romantic liberals thought, which is that we are here to be great and interesting, and provide, a new way of thinking, um, and the history of art is the great repository of some of those. But of course, we would want art not to be separate from the way we live individually and collectively, but integrated into it. It's just that we can't have forms of art that are premised on kind of antisocial um, hierarchy. Nietzsche provided one model for that, neoliberalism another, nor forms that destroy the canvas for the artist, like environmental damage is doing.
It seems to me that the idea, I mean, in its economic itineration, its growth, that is very integral to liberal thinking, to certainly neoliberal thinking. But development progress is a very central thing. And here's something else that always makes me very skeptical. I mean, we can't have growth and we can't have no growth. We can't have growth because it destroys the planet, but no growth also probably means no social state and no very expensive institutions of democracies and no defense against Vladimir Putin. So how is it possible to liberal your way out of this conundrum?
Well, that's in an American idiom, you're now asking questions beyond my pay grade. Like if I had the answer to that question, uh, I would be,
No, but what I also mean is don't you break liberalism if you take away the idea of growth?
very possibly. I mean, maybe I'm forced to worry that we would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, either by neglecting that liberalism can survive or thrive in degrowth frameworks, or maybe there are forms of growth that can be triaged and can be kept even as other forms are abandoned. But no, of course you're right that liberalism is very closely connected to an addiction to growth that seems unsustainable to many of us. I would add though that um, many have worried that degrowth would lead to fascism, because you and I might say we're willing to live within our means or with a steady state of consumption, but many people will not say that. And when they're forced to live less conspicuously consumerist lives, they will um, get rid of liberalism and democracy. And if that's true, then the consequences of degrowth could be worse than any accomplishments it provides. So I mean, we're in a moment where we're so far from even moving to degrowth. Um, growth remains hegemonic. That these questions need to be asked and pondered. Because at a certain point, we may well need to experiment with liberalism without growth.
But I think we're really getting to a nub here, and one that I find very interesting. I was once chatting to Richard Sennett, and he said, Richard is, for people who don't know him, now in his 70s, professor of sociology, and he said, my grandfather in Chicago had only 2 suits, but that was okay because there wasn't that much to buy back then, which I thought was a gigantic sentence, because we talked earlier about narratives crumbling, and I always think that people nowadays get much of their identity through their consumption, through the brands they consume, through the sort of signals they give in that, which is a pretty exhausting way of creating your identity, also because it's made to be very brittle, because you have to keep getting the stuff. The idea that there are societies that are not based on that, where you have to get your respect not through the suit you're wearing, but through something else in your life. Now, we've seen that there are many models that are harmful to a lot of people. I mean, the idea of an estate, the idea of a caste, of men and women, of Christians and non-Christians, etc. Identities that were firm created a lot of damage. What could a liberal identity look like that finds markers of respect that are not rooted in conspicuous consumption? What models, what kind of a range of options is there for constructing something like that, a liberal identity?
Well, so to me, it's a nub, but I feel that liberal history allows a much clearer answer. So, you know, if we look at the liberals over time, they emerge, even as they're talking about Bildung and creativity and so forth, they forge an alliance with laissez-faire and the free market. And this costs them because even though socialists, sometimes are liberals rethinking their creed, like John Stuart Mill became a socialist by the end of his life, a liberal socialist. A lot of socialists, attacked liberalism as incompatible with fairness and freedom for all. And yet liberals did respond by saying we can face the market and say it's not best thought of as a place for freedom, but as the means for creating social freedom. And so we may need to tax a lot of people, sometimes at very high rates, for the sake of freedom, and engage in interference, precisely coercive interference, for the sake of collective freedom. And to me, this is a lesson that is directly applicable to your hypothetical. I mean, if we concluded that you just don't need all of those consumer choices, which are destroying the planet, then we would constrain those. But it wouldn't be to constrain choice, but to make it more sustainable and about the right things, so that you're choosing genuine creativity rather than like how exactly to use product purchasing to make yourself distinctive, which doesn't succeed in doing. So it doesn't strike me as the hardest problem intellectually. It's a huge problem politically, because we're not at the point of saying most consumption does not make people happy, let alone interesting. And with environmental concern, needs to be, drastically restricted, so that we can return to Richard Sennett's father's situation, where you live for what's important, not to have more than 2 suits.
This is such an important moment for the possible future of liberalism. I was reading something today by a philosopher who said he would not be surprised if by the end of the century there would be half a dozen states in the United States today. and they would go very different ways. And this liberal project, which was an 18th century liberal project that went very interesting highways and byways, would be finished. But just to round off this really wonderful conversation, let me ask you, you obviously take much of your inspiration from the 19th century, from Mill and from other thinkers who were really the inventors of this liberal creed. At a moment, of course, also of, it's always, sorry, I'm rambling, but none of the Enlightenment utopias worked because they were basically created for agrarian societies. They didn't foresee the Industrial Revolution and the change of capital and class and etc. Mill already lived in that time. And that, of course, if we had another hour, I would start asking you, what about technology and acceleration in our lives? And how do they disrupt our identities and our possibilities of making political decisions? Because I think, personally, I think that biological evolution tends to be linear and technological tends to be exponential, and we just can't keep up. But just going back to this incipient moment of liberalism in the midst of industrial revolution, what are the lighthouse ideas do you think that we need for the 21st century that got trampled in the history of liberalism in between?
So it's a great question on which to conclude. Just to be clear, I'm not nostalgic for the liberal tradition in the way that others are nostalgic for the Christian tradition or tradition in general. I think in the end we matter now, and we have to critically retrieve anything from the past, including the liberal past, and leave a lot behind, because all of the main liberals, including Mill and Tocqueville, were, for example, imperialists and so forth. So what is there to retrieve? Well, I think I would retrieve a moral ideal. We've discussed it substantially. It's the idea that liberalism stands not for privatizing freedom and the good, but saying that we should have a public culture of achievement on creative and innovative terms. That is the point of our lives and our societies. That's what liberals stood for. In the book, I talk more than we have about not just their ideas about the good life, but also their ideas about history, because they were strongly committed to at least thinking of history as a kind of stage for collective emancipation, since freedom in more forms and are not just going to magically appear, but we need a narrative of the kind Hegel or others provided about how we moved and are moving from less freedom to more, without saying it's inevitable or without saying there aren't setbacks. But then third, I would say we need a theory of institutions. And probably there, the 19th century is least useful. I think Mill, even in On Liberty, focused most on limiting the state from harming human beings. That's his doctrine, the harm principle. Tocqueville, I think, was more interesting because he understood that you need a mix of private and public institutions for liberalism to survive and thrive. I would say, we need more thought in this direction. From the Enlightenment, and liberals inherit this, it's clear that the central liberal institution is the school, because we need to equip people for freedom. The question is, as adults, how do we create an institutional setting in which we're not just equipped, but encouraged to exercise our creative freedom more rather than less? The question of, the market, we've discussed substantially. we both agree there need to be kind of constraints on the centrality of the market to our lives and what the freedoms of the market allow. But, liberals, I think, are failing now, not least because they're not imagining the institutions of a free society. And that's if liberalism is going to be around for a while, it's going to have to think through those.
Sam, thank you so much. And perhaps we'll meet up again in 20, 30, or 50 years to see how things have worked out. Personally, I hope that we meet much sooner than that. Samuel Moyn, thank you for being a guest on the Blomcast. And if you enjoyed this show, and even if you didn't, write a comment, an angry protest, ecstatic praise is also okay. You can like this show, give us a little thumbs up, or you can even subscribe to it. Tell your aunties and uncles and all your best friends about this, and even the odd enemy. I would be very happy to see you again. Philip Blom says, see you next time.